What is up guys, Grim here, and in today's video I'm going to teach you guys what to look out for when you should be picking your league starter for the up and coming league. So this is going to be a bit of a longer video, a bit of a long form one, but at the end of this you're going to be properly equipped to basically have all the knowledge you need to understand whether what you're looking at is going to translate into what you want in game. So, a lot of people always ask me, is this league starter good? Is this skill good? What do you reckon about this? Well, instead of giving a man a fish, I'm going to teach the man to fish. And you guys are going to understand how to evaluate league starters for your goals in the 3.15 and beyond in terms of the build. So, sit down, listen to a little bit of old Grimro's advice, and let's get into it. So first of all, first thing you need to consider is playstyle. This is where you should start. If you're a fan of melee, you should play melee. If you're a fan of minions, play minions. You should always play what you find most enjoyable, unless you're a true meta slave. And if you're just starting out, maybe just pick something that looks really cool. That's going to be what's going to be straight up. And that's where you should always start your journey in picking a league starter. Next up is going to be a little bit more advanced, and that is goals. So goals in Path of Exile take many different forms based on how much you've played and kind of what you're trying to get out of the game. If you just want to try and beat Cirrus for the first time, well, that's going to be a different goal. If you're trying to farm currency and maybe beat Uberelder on day one, that's a different goal altogether as well. And your league starter needs to match up with both your experience levels and your goals. So for example, for me, my goal is to rush bosses as fast as possible. And I wanted to do it as early as possible. So I want to be able to do, for example, Shaper on day one. And that is all I care about really, and getting into some of that endgame bossing farming. So my league starter is geared towards that, and you can see that kind of in the background here. This is what I'm hoping I'm going to have available to me on day one, but that's only possible because I have so much experience. So your league starter needs to reflect both your ability to play the game / experience, and also your goals. So if you're trying to go for a mapper, a really fast mapper on league start, that's not going to be a summoner. You're going to have to maybe pick up like something different. But yeah, make sure that the goals of your league starter align with what you're actually picking. Otherwise, it's not going to work out quite how you want it. All right, next section here, BS detection. So it's no secret that many content creators on both YouTube and Twitch, unfortunately, don't, for example, show the build doing what they're saying it can do. A lot of people market boss killers, and they say, this build is capable of all content. Well, in reality, it's probably not capable of all content in the hands of most players. Perhaps that player is incredibly skilled at the game. Or perhaps, it's actually not even capable of doing it altogether, and they were, deceiving you. So overall, I pretty much don't believe it until I see it, and that, more than ever in 3.15, is going to be important. So for all of my kind of league start prep, I've been testing on a 5-link with no damage or defensive flasks. I want to make sure that everyone who picks my build gets the closest and most accurate representation of what you may be able to expect on a reasonable budget. That's how I always approach things, and that's how I've approached things in the past. So you need to make sure that what is being basically sold to you is accurate, and make sure that there's at least some footage of them doing a boss so you can get a feel for what it actually looks like. It's very, very, very important to have that, especially when it comes to mapping. Something might be an incredible bosser and they're marketing it as a league starter, but really one of the massive components of having a good bosser at league start is able to get through the Atlas quick. So you need to make sure that everything is shown and you're not just having the wool pulled over your eyes. Next up with the BS detection is, does the POB look realistic? So there's a lot of different things to look out for here, and it is going to take a little bit of a seasoned veteran to pick out bullshit basically from a POB, but I'm going to give you guys a few things that you can kind of look for. And the first one here is damage multipliers ticked in the calculations in Path of Building. That's kind of the format most people go with, and being able to discern whether or not someone is going overboard with the things that they have ticked is incredibly important. So generally, I always untick everything from the POBs and then work backwards myself from what I think is realistic. And if it's not immediately apparent that it's going to be on 100% of the time, I'm not going to have that ticked. And you guys should be particularly wary of flasks in 3.15. If you untick all of the flasks on a bossing character and suddenly they lose 75% of their damage because they're crit based using a dying sun, there is definitely a lot to be worried about there, because that's going to punish a player that can't take advantage of burst windows and stuff like that, or flask management, and that may make it so a build is no longer as powerful as it once should have been. So yeah, definitely make sure that you untick everything. So that's flasks, and also stuff like the config. The things that I really look out for are things like shock. People tend to tick that one even if they're not able to shock really that much. As well as making sure that the boss configuration is set to Cirrus or Shaper. If it's left on normal, it's going to have heavily inflated damage numbers, and it's just not realistic, and you will get absolutely shafted on League Start when you play that build and try and do bosses with it. The next one I want to point out here is the items. So this, again, is something that is pretty difficult to gauge and is going to depend a lot on your experience and your ability to manipulate the economy in Path of Exile. So items obviously are expensive in some cases, and of course videos do serve to inflate stuff as well. So there's definitely a lot of stuff to talk about here, but I do want to talk about some big, kind of like noticeable ones and things to look out for. The first one I want to point out here is synthesis items. If anyone has any sort of synthesis items, I'm talking about with synthesized implicits, you can basically just immediately discount that League Starter unless there's some sort of explanation around it and how you're going to get that. No League Starter should contain synthesis items, pretty much full stop. Next one is corrupted items. So this one pretty much falls in the same area as synthesis items. If you're looking up an Ellie hit build and it's got a +2 Frostferno or something like that on it with a corruption on it, you can pretty much discount that as well. It's incredibly difficult to get any sort of good corruptions early in the first 3 or 4 days, and they're probably going to be very expensive if they are present on the market, and even more so if some guide is recommending them. So corrupted items, if that is a large portion of damage on a League Starter, definitely look twice and reconsider. And the last one I want to talk about here is insane rares. So if you see a build and it's got like 4 mod like jewels on it or something like that, or a bow with like multi-mod on it, without it being explained in the guide, you should definitely be questioning whether this build has integrity, because you could easily be getting jebaited on the title there. So definitely pretty crazy. So yeah, definitely keep your wits about you and make sure you're definitely analyzing what's being sold to you in the POB. It's always good to be skeptical, and I encourage everyone to do so, even with my builds. The last one here I want to do is, has this build been tried and tested? We went over it a little bit earlier, but this is specifically kind of targeted at the 3.15 expansion. A lot of guides just get rebranded for the next patch and they say, yeah, it's all good, but they never really went back and tested it. So this is my assumption here. I find it hard to believe that anyone has done thorough testing outside of the creators releasing one build guide. If you see some guy with 10 build guides, it's very likely they haven't actually tested any of them, like with how they feel on like a 5 link or a 4 link in some cases, overall, and they're probably just sat in Path of Building, tweaking the numbers a little bit and then pumping out videos. That is a massive red flag, and you should definitely consider, is this actually going to work? Because there's stuff like mana costs, specifically with mines, is incredibly high now, and then there's a nerf to Enduring Mana Flask, which mine is also used. That's just an example. So you do have to really understand what you're kind of looking at and make sure you analyze it and think about it. What is this person actually, selling me something that is going to be good? Next up, all right, end game. All right, so as someone who, you know, I guess I'll boast a little bit here, has killed a lot of the bosses on day 1, and, you know, cleared pretty much all of endgame, including Maven last league on day 2, I do have a fairly good grasp of what it takes to get a league starter to that point early game, and what kind of damage figures you need to be looking at to make it feel good. So the first thing I want to talk about here is obviously realistic damage versus uptime. Now, what do I mean by this? So, if you take a build like a minion build, like you're seeing in the background here, with, let's just say this build has about 8 million DPS right now on its full build, and then you compare that to, for example, an 8 million damage build of Frostblades. You might think that's fine and that that's comparable. It's in fact not even close, and that is due to the fact that uptime is a concept that most people dismiss. When I mean uptime, I'm talking about how often you're dealing that 8 million DPS to a boss or to anything really in the game. This is an incredibly important concept, and let's say that a Frostblades character only has 25% uptime on a fight like Uberelder, which honestly isn't unrealistic given how many abilities there are to dodge and, you know, like how much, you know, is going on. And that only gets worse in things like the Feared, etc. Then you would actually need 4 times the damage, or you would need some sort of a mechanic to burst bosses and instant phase them, and those aren't generally conducive with league start scenarios, which is why you see a lot of people go for stuff that can kite or that can do damage passively. That's why most of the best players in this game play stuff like damage over time, minions, and totems at league start. You know, people like to meme on it, but it's because it has very high damage uptime for the amount of damage you're getting. And later on, people go with these crazy attack builds because you can burst bosses and avoid most of their mechanics on attack-based builds. So, if you're looking at some PoBs and you're like, oh yeah, 10 million DPS Cyclone, that's way better than this 3 million DPS ED Contagion build, you actually may need to do another look, and you need to see and look at the bossing footage that they've provided to see how much uptime they kind of have, and kind of see like what that looks like. It's very important to understand that. I'm going to throw out some figures here to kind of get you guys, give you guys a picture of what you should be looking for in the damage department to make things really, really good. So in the background here, I mentioned this is around 8 million. Maybe it's a little bit more if you factor in the exposure from zombies with the elemental army on there and the Culling Strike, but it's around 8 million DPS. So if you think that this looks really, really cruisy and smooth, well, this is 8 million DPS with close to 100% uptime with the Predator support gem. And it's also got perfect targeting due to Predator support gem. So this is pretty much the pinnacle of, you know, kind of perfect 100% uptime, which is why I picked this build. Now, the best kind of indication of what to do bosses, in my opinion, is for basically baseline level bosses. So I'm talking Uber Elder, Shaper, Elder, and stuff like that, where you have a pretty good understanding of the mechanics on hand. I would say that you probably want, for it to feel good, upwards of 2 million DPS with 100% uptime. That's the kind of bare minimum I would go with. Anything below that, and it's not going to feel good, and you're not going to get very much bang for your buck farming these bosses because it's just going to take so much longer, and you're much better off looking at doing mapping with that character instead. Now, if you want to compare this to kind of like what it actually feels like really good, I generally shoot for around 4 mil. 2 mil is like the bottom of the barrel kind of thing. Like 4 million is really good, and this is again 100% uptime for it to feel really, really strong. If you guys want a kind of reference point, I believe the Shaper has around 75 million HP, and he does heal by about 50% of his life bar over the fight as well. So that, you know, that's upwards of 100 million, and if you're only doing a million and you have like 25% uptime, you know, you're starting to see how that's like 400 seconds or something like that. Like, I haven't done the math, but you know, you get what I mean. It's a lot of time, and that's very, very important, and it's going to give you like less opportunity to nail the mechanics perfectly, and overall it's going to make the fight a lot harder. So yeah, baseline 2 million, bottom of the barrel for basic bosses, and then when you start going up to, you know, like double Guardian maps, which, you know, have both Phoenix and Minotaur, and they heal up. That's when you really need that 4 million as the baseline. And then when you start to throw Maven Witnessing into that equation, and you're starting to talk about invitations, you know, it's probably still around that 4 million, but you do need to be quite good with that 4 million, and it does, you know, require some dodging. You're not going to be insta-phasing things on 4 million with 100% uptime. It's definitely going to be a little bit difficult, and that's really what it is at the end of the day. So yeah, 2 million on the bottom end, 4 million is probably feels pretty good, and then any more after that is bonus. So yeah, okay, so that's kind of damage, gives you guys a bit of an idea of what you should be looking for at least the end game bossing scenario. Obviously, you can do maps on significantly less than that, and it's going to feel really, really good. If you're just shooting for that, or you're just starting out, then that's okay. You don't need to go crazy on the damage, but if you have an intention to do end game, you must make sure the damage is there, otherwise it's going to be incredibly difficult to do these encounters without messing up, and without having a really, really tough time of it. And that's just from my point of view. All right, next up, let's do defense. So I'm going to give you guys a bit of a tip here, and let me just jump into path of building. We have it open here. When you're looking at defense on a character, it's critically important to make sure that you go into the calcs over here, if it'll load. Whoop, come on. All right, calcs, come on. Path of building seems to always have a few issues with my computer. All right, calcs here. And you want to be taking a look at two numbers here, specifically for physical damage. So whenever people talk about getting one shot in this game, it's more than likely not elemental damage that's killing you, it's actually physical damage. And having a game plan for physical damage is incredibly important for players just starting out this game, or players who, you know, aren't as familiar with the mechanics of the game. Now, most really, really cheap league starters completely sacrifice defenses completely to achieve the numbers I was talking about earlier, that 2 or 4 million. They completely throw defense to the wayside, and they don't care about it at all, making those league starters very, very bad for newer players or players just getting into the game. So if you're looking for a more, like, you know, kind of consistent and balanced and accessible experience, this is the part that you need to pay attention to. So most endgame bosses hit for around 8,000 physical damage with a lot of their abilities. A good example of this is Hydra, another one is Minotaur. They hit for around 8,000. So you can see here, my character here, if you look at maximum hit, can only take 7,500 physical damage with bone armor up. So I'm going to get one shot by a lot of abilities. I'm okay with that. And when I market my build, I'm going to tell people that. But, you know, if you come in here and it says 4K Fizz Mitigation, maximum hit, well, you're going to die not just to bosses, you're pretty much going to die to everything. Any sort of big physical hit is going to almost one-shot your character, and it could be a very frustrating experience to play. So yeah, as I mentioned, it's around 8,000 damage that you get hit by some of these endgame bosses, and map modifiers take this even further. So my character, for example, that I'm league starting, it dies to stuff like Minotaur Rubble with map rolls on it. It's just going to get one shot by it. It's the reality of it. I sacrificed defense in order to gain offense. And that is the kind of the secret to doing bosses really, really quickly in the end game. The other number you should look at here is effective hit pool. This can actually sometimes mitigate, you know, how low the maximum hit taken is. A good example of this is characters that take Acro and Phase Acro. This is basically going to contribute to your effective hit pool. Effective hit pool basically means after all mitigation. Maximum hit means if you get hit, how much are you taking? So I have block on my character, so there is like a 30% chance over here that my character just doesn't take damage from attack-based hits, which means, you know, if I get hit by one of those Minotaur slams, I might not die, which is pretty handy. I appreciate that. Saves me some portals sometimes, and that's going to pump up your effective hit pool, which is really, really good. On characters such as Dodge and Acro, and, you know, I'm going to refer to a character build guide that was posted recently by my friend Crouching Tuna. That build is incredibly defensive. It has incredible effective hit pool, and he also has over 8,000 maximum hit on the physical. So it's actually a really, really good build for beginners, and I'm going to recommend that one if you guys want to check out a more defensive based build. But yeah, if this is any lower than you like 5,000, it's going to be really, really difficult to play. And anyone who played Freeze Pulse Totems that I played last time is going to know exactly what I mean by this. It's going to be an absolute pain. You're going to die to the lead mechanic. You're going to die to random rares. You're going to die to pretty much anything. If a physical mortar hits you, you're dead. All sorts of stuff like that. Elemental's a little bit more forgiving. You can see here that my maximum hit is 29,000. That's fine. Most things aren't going to hit you for 29,000. Believe it or not, the damage is actually fairly similar between elemental and physical in this game, which is, a complete balancing nightmare. I don't know why it's like that, but it is what it is. So physical is what you want to be looking for on the maximum hit. All right, let's go back to the footage because it's pretty good. Let's zoom back in. All right, next up, let's talk about cost. All right, cost is a big one. So when you're seeing builds, you really have to factor in how you're going to actually acquire those items. If you have big plans to farm a lot of bosses early, or you have not much knowledge about acquiring currency in this game, this is a really big sticking point. If someone's marketing a League starter with a 6th link Chavaron's wrappings, well, that's just not a League starter. I'm sorry. That is, even for me, not a viable League starter for most of the time, because you need to have a lot of currency to acquire that. That's a 6 or 7 exalt item right there. That's a lot of money. At the end of the day, it's fine to have 1 or 2 of those items, but that's basically it. If you have more than 1 or 2 of those items, it's going to be ridiculous. An example of that on my current League starter is Soul Rest. I imagine this is going to be probably a 4 or 5 exalt item, and you need it for the build to function. Most of the meta builds will require 1 or 2 of these items, but it does sometimes get to a point where it's pushing it. The best League starters don't have any items, which are really outlandishly rare or expensive, but sometimes you have to go and splash out on an item which is really expensive in order to get a League starter to work, but most of the time the really good ones don't. Again, I'm going to refer back to Toxic Rain, Caustic Arrow, which is a pretty good League starter as a mapper this league, and I'd probably check that out if you really want a really super duper budget one. Which is definitely pretty accessible there. But yeah, definitely beware of any 6-link uniques which aren't super duper common. It's definitely potentially going to be a bottleneck in your progression, and it's going to hurt you at League start, especially if you're a newer player. All right, let's get on to the next one. And that is going to be the power curve. So we're going to go through a few things here. But the power curve is super duper important for a build. So most build guides, unfortunately, don't really talk about the early game of the build. They just only talk about the last build, last end game version of the build, when they show it killing Maven and all sorts of stuff like that, which is great. It's a pretty good starting point. But for most players, that's not going to explain how to get there, and that is actually the hard part. I could give my character to pretty much anyone watching this video right now, and there's a pretty high chance that they'd be able to do most content with it once they had a few goes at it. But getting to the point in which you have this character is the tough part, specifically with the one I'm playing. I'll give you kind of an example. You have to start out as skeletons in the story, and then before you get the staff, because it's pretty difficult to get, you're going to be playing carrying golems with some clay shapers, and then when you finally get to the staff, you can transition into soul rest. So that's kind of the power progression of my build, and I'm going to make sure to explain that to people in the guide that I'm about to put out in a few hours. But a lot of people don't, and some of the more obscure builds, for example, I'll give you an example here. I was considering a Hierophant Elemental Hit Totem build, and I completely shelved it because the early game was just going to be a nightmare. If you're starting out as an obscure ascendancy for the skill you're using, it can get very difficult to make your way through the acts or through the early maps of the game. And that is very, very important, and why people get stuck on these builds and they're like, I picked this starter, it didn't do so great, why didn't it do so great? Well, it's because you couldn't get to the point in which it really starts to shine because you were hamstrung by the poor early game. That is really important. It's one of the most important things to make sure you have a powerful and strong early game. So yeah, definitely something to consider. And there's 3 portions to that. There's the acts, in which you really want a strong build to power through that, so there needs to be a game plan for that. There's the mid game, which is your whites, yellows, and maybe reds, where you don't really have access to anything but rares and maybe a really, really common unique or 2. And then there's the end game, where you can start getting your soul rests, where you can start getting your primordial mites and stuff like that on the build. And then you need a game plan to be able to get to that point. And this is obviously a ton of stuff to consider, a ton of stuff to work through. And if any of these are missing, guess who's going to have to figure that out? That's you. And that can be a pretty tough task at League start, especially when you're not the build creator yourself, when you have to kind of piece things together. So it can be a little bit difficult. All right, last and closing thoughts here. is going to be the Great Unknown. So 3.15 is a bit of a unique patch. It basically makes it so all build guides that were created before these 2 days we've had to min-max and look at the patch notes are questionable. If people were marketing a build as having, 10 million DPS, in some cases it has like 1.5 now. So you need to make sure you take their POBs. If you're thinking about an old build, update them and see what the damage is now. Match it against those yardsticks that I was talking about earlier and see if it stacks up. Very, very important there. And it's going to do you a lot of favors in the long run when picking your build and league start. The next topic I want to talk about here is mana. So mana is a really, really important one that has seen the biggest change and is perhaps the biggest change overall in the new patch. Mana has greatly been changed. It's like completely different than it used to be before, specifically with some skills like mines. So if you're looking at a miner league start, and even if they've got testing, even if they've got everything on display, and they're like talking about it's looking really, really good, you need to consider the massive mana nerf. It's possible that you just won't even be able to use the skill properly in the capacity that they're showing in the video until you've done the math, until they've done the math and shown you and proven it to you. It could be a complete disaster, and you could end up having to use some reduced mana stuff on gear or tree or something like that and try and figure that out at the last second at league start, which would be really, really difficult. So make sure that they have a game plan for that. Make sure you understand the changes really well, which apply to your build, and that's going to really, really help you in the long run. So closing thoughts here. Obviously, there's a ton of things to consider, and you need to have a fairly discerning eye to pick out the good league starts from the bad league starts. And I can tell you, there is certainly a lot of deception going on in some of these videos, and a lot of people are all about that click. Now, there obviously are a few really good ones out there, and a lot of those will have the things that I've talked about here. They might not be the most post-produced or, like highly edited videos ever, but they are just really, really good to follow along, and you're going to have a lot of success with it. But it really does all come back down to what you guys find fun and exciting and what your goals are. If you're a new player, a lot of this might sound a bit confusing to you. 2 million, 4 million, why do I need that? I'm just trying to get through yellow maps. Makes sense, make sure you pick a build maybe that's good at doing maps and you get a lot further than you used to. But yeah, make sure you do kind of pay attention here and make sure you definitely look out for the finer details. My build guide is going to be coming up soon, so make sure you pay attention to that if you like some of this, and it's going to be a really good one in my opinion. And overall, I'm super stoked and hyped for the new league. Hopefully you guys are too. Sorry for the long video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.